I would like to because as I think I've made kind of more or less clear, I have a great debt to Quebec Anthropology. I mean, and you know I would like to say something about that, and it's nothing more than just personal, but when I was in the early years at Western, and I worked with some of the early anthropologists at Laval, and in Quebec, and I'm thinking of Gilles Bibot, whom I liked very much, Pierre Miranda, who was very unusual and was very smart, and we overlapped in some of our interests, as I said, Jean-Jacques Charlifoux and particularly Marc-Adelaide Tremblay. I mean, there was for me that those guys were very unusual and very bright. And I think that I'm not so sure that the rest of Canada, largely because they didn't speak French so much, some did, but not many, really appreciated what a lot of energy there was, particularly in the Laval department. It was really fun. I mean, there was a lot of energy there, a lot of hardworking people who wrote very interesting things, and nobody knew about it. Very few people knew about it, but I knew about it, and I had to just make not a footnote, but a kind of an acknowledgement that had a really big impact on me. And I'll give an interesting example. I've mentioned the importance of Marc-Adelaide Tremblay to me. I've mentioned it to you, and I've mentioned it to, in the course of this narrative. But one of the things about him was and about a lot of his colleagues was there was a moral commitment, a very interesting moral commitment that you didn't find in many people, and an honesty and a genuineness. And he was a great anthropologist, but he was also a great person. And so I modeled myself after him for a while. He wasn't very political, so we didn't have that in common. He wasn't political at all, but he was kind. And he did a lot of very important work on Aboriginal people and on Native communities. He did just incredible work. And one of the works that I would like to make a mention of was his involvement in the Stirling County studies. And I don't know how many people know about that, but as long as we're speaking about, I'm sure some people have talked about it, but maybe not, talking about Canadian anthropology, one of the great things, one of the great studies ever in Canada, anthropology studies, was the work of Alexander Layton and Marc-Adelaide Tremblay, and the study of the area on the south shore of Nova Scotia. And I don't know, do people know about that? I don't know. Probably not. But, Addie Tremblay did his PhD at Cornell, and that's where he ran into Alexander Layton. And they decided to do a long-term, very intense study of this one area that they called Stirling County, but it was really the area around Weymouth and the Africadian, and the Canadian, the Acadian communities in and around Church Point, Pointe l'Église in Nova Scotia. It was great. And I had the privilege of just reading some of that stuff. And it was astonishing. It was so good and so clever and such a very wonderful piece of modern ethnography in Canada. And he had done that with Alexander Layton, and they won, of course, many, many awards, and I'm sure it's been long since forgotten. But I didn't forget about it, and when I did the study in northern Pakistan, that was a similar thing because we studied those communities intensively. We studied the spices that they bought. We studied the children they had. And we had the same 800 households over 10 years. We studied every single one of them and how their land holdings, how their families changed, how their incomes changed, what happened to them personally, so we could understand the impact of development. And so I always felt that I had learned so much from that work that had been done by Tremblay. So I've often made an enormous. I really have felt an enormous debt, and I don't think people understand how important that was. That stuff probably it isn't these days. None of people read it anymore, but I was just very impressed with. And the story goes farther because my interest in writing continued, and I, just by some quirk of fate, came to have a close relationship with the South Shore of Nova Scotia, quite independently of the Stirling County studies and my interest in them, which I had read. And it had, in between marriages, I met a woman here and had a close relationship with her, and she was from there. She was one of the African descendants who had come to settle, whose ancestors had come to settle in Nova Scotia, and who created what many people call the Africadian communities. And they have on the shore. This is what we were talking about fishing, because I was very curious, because some of them actually have boats, and they have trawlers, and they are draggers, and they fish. And so I joined some fishing, but I was very fascinated. I went out here to meet her parents, and I was very fascinated by these coastal communities, and in particular, because she was of African descent, particularly the lives of these ex-slaves, they called them black loyalists, who had come and settled in the interior of Nova Scotia and made homes. I mentioned a little while ago about a book that took me 20 years to write. This is it. And it's this one. And it came out about 3-4 years ago, though I began, I am very ashamed to say, I began it in the 90s, in the 1990s. It's one of the hardest books I ever wrote, but it was one. It's one of the most important books because it has inspiration from all over the world, and it is about the area where Marc Adelaide wrote the Stirling County study. It takes place in the same area, and so much so that, in fact, he gave me his field notes, and many of the people that who he had interviewed were people that I ended up interviewing myself for this book. It's a novel. But not really. I mean, it's an historical novel. And I became very intrigued by the struggles of the black communities who came here because the British were trying to undermine the southern states' economy by enticing the slaves away from the plantations. And therefore, they thought they might do some damage to the southern economy and diminish or increase the British chances of winning the Revolutionary War. Obviously, that part of it wasn't a great success, but it did happen that over 3,000 or 4,000 slaves, first-generation African immigrants, were shipped to Nova Scotia, and then they made a life. Their lives were amazing, and by the mid 1800s, they had begun to cohere. All these many little communities had begun to cohere through a church, and I wrote, and so I found it very interesting, given their disenfranchised status, given the difficulties that they had in interacting with whites on the coast, the success of some of them, and the fact that many of these people were really such extraordinary characters. One was one of the greatest boxers that ever lived, a guy named Langford. One was one of the greatest opera singers, came out of these communities and stuff like that. Little matter about my book, but the book that I did end up writing, which really I think has become so important to my career and brought together parts of my anthropological background, the study of communities, the study of religion, and my interest in disenfranchised communities came together in this book, all of which is very closely linked to my interest in Quebec Anthropology. I thought it would be a good story to tell because, and it's actually had this book's had an interesting career. Frankly, it's about a part of Canada which is not as well known, maybe as Ontario and stuff like that. But it certainly is an unusual. The story ended up being fascinating, and I was able to do it largely because the archives at Acadia University are so extraordinary, and it was based on some of those archives. Anyways, it is in that direction that my interest in literature and in writing literature, because it is a literary book, continued. But that takes us afield. What?
Yeah, you refer to CASCA, maybe. I don't know if you have something to say about the history of CASCA or the Canadian anthropology, how you would see it, and because you participated in these early meetings.
Well, many early meetings. I mean, it was for many of us who were very committed to making anthropology a forceful and inspirational discipline in Canada, and there was a lot of energy for that. I mean, and I'm sure that many of the people that you've mentioned that you're going to interview were very instrumental in this. It wasn't just a career for people, not at all. It was a calling, and so CASCA was fun. Originally, we called it the Canadian Ethnology Society, Sociétés and Département, and that was our that was our main thing. But then it merged, and it became CASCA. But really, we did a lot of things, and my memories are just I was president for a year and spent an awful lot of time trying to promote it and making the gatherings exceptionally interesting, and they were so much fun, and then committing ourselves particularly to the active participation in the International Union of Anthropological and Ethnological Sciences, IUAES, and all of us were very, very active and went, and then the meetings were held in Canada, and we were very active. I mean, I guess that's in a way that's what I remember. That's what I recall, and it was one of the things that brought us all together, and I think it brought a lot of people into anthropology because people from abroad began to come and do anthropology in Canada, and I think particularly anthropology in some parts of Canada became quite well known. People began to come and recognize it as a really a good source of expertise. I guess that's what you're mentioning, and also, I mean, it's important to note that in its very origin, unlike the American Anthropological Association, and unlike other, like particularly the British ethnology societies, Canada was from the very beginning very international. Part of it was the asset that we had that there are two languages, and so people felt very comfortable in it. A lot of energy. It was a lot of fun, and I think that I feel very, very privileged to have been part of the early days of that. But anthropology, but that's very much in the past, I guess, because I then, after my involvement with the United Nations and my decision to strike out on my own as an independent researcher and writer, I created a corporation. I founded a corporation, hired people, and did all kinds of contracts, and that changed my life very much so. It didn't take me that far afield from anthropology. And you did ask what remained of anthropology in that new profession, if I may call it that. And I've thought about that. And maybe I can say a word. There's one thing that in the world of development and in this juggernaut of development expertise which has blossomed during this time, that threatened always to be missing. And it was a clear and unequivocal interest in what is happening at the local level. And I've always felt, most planners in the World Bank or the United Nations or even UNICEF, even these sincere ones like UNICEF, and I won't say that they're all sincere, certainly not FAO, for example, but in these sincere ones, this is often, missing. And I've often felt that, for me anyway, the reason one of the things that I bring as with a tradition in anthropology, or with a background in anthropology, is I've always tried to look very closely at communities and how communities are structured. And if you can, and once you understand communities and how they work, and you understand the importance of equality, of equity, and equal access to resources, you can understand certainly what some of the terms of a program of growth have to be. And it has to be one that allows access to people. And unless you have a pretty strong access by people to resources, and unless you have a very strong ethos of equity, this is probably not going to work. So not only, so that's what anthropology, takes you to appreciation of local level. But at the same time, if you don't, you have to apply that to national level planning. But this did represent a rather significant change in my career, and one that I have enjoyed very much for the last 20 years, no doubt about that. And I can talk about a little bit about that.
Yeah, and you published this book, Development from Within. Is that connected to what you just said?
Yeah. Shortly before I left, as my company was growing and as I was beginning to move away from the university, and in fact, during the year that I formally left the university, the book came out. And there were a lot of reasons for writing this book, Transforming Development. I mean, by that time I had become a full-fledged development, whatever. And, I had kind of most of my network and most of my associates and people who were in poli-sci and economics. But it was very interesting because in the late 80s, a dramatic change took place, which the Canadian development planners, and I'm talking about CEDA, in particular, though Foreign Affairs is also implicated, did not take cognizance of. And I think I'd like to say a word about that. When Gorbachev introduced the ideas of glasnost and perestroika, and when the Soviet Empire then underwent a major transformation it didn't fall apart. It just went. The different components of it went their separate ways. But most importantly, it was the end of the Cold War. And at the end of the Cold War, so many of the regimes around the world, African regimes, Asian regimes, South American regimes, that had been supported by these small dictators, and the small dictators supported by their patrons, the Soviets or the Americans, they fell apart. And there sprang up in many of these countries where I ended up working, there sprang up civil wars because the capacity and the resources to keep the lid had been removed. It had been removed by the cessation of competition between the two world powers. Conflict, not surprisingly at that time, tripled, quadrupled in frequency around the world. Wars changed dramatically, from wars that had to do with wars between nation states to wars within states. The motivation for wars was no longer patriotism or anything like that, but it was for it was a job. It was for economic reasons, and the capacity of the world at large, the capacity of the international organizations, the capacity of the great NGOs, and so on to contain these very destructive wars, civil wars in particular, fell apart. So the problem for anthropology changed. And because one of the biggest problems of anthropology, what then became, how do you deal with conflict? How do you help communities who are beset, by conflicts? How do you help nation states repair themselves? And most of the problems that were kind of on the fringe of attention on the part of development professionals all of a sudden emerged. A few of them became particularly important. One of them was conflict, the poverty that was created by conflict. And so this book was put together with many of the people who were on the forefront of, like Ian Smiley and people like that. I mentioned to you Norman Uphoff. There was, and it wasn't just a Canadian book, but it was an international book. But most of the people were from Canada who dealt with that. So at the same time, it was the only book that, at least that I knew about. I think it probably was the only reader in development made up primarily of Canadian expertise. So it was great. Cran Pratt, politics from Toronto. And so it was. I think it was widely used, and it also occurred at a time when I think the Canadian International Development Agency began to have its heyday, began to fall in hard times, because as long as it had inspirational figures like Norman Peterson, and other luminaries from Canada who had encouraged Canada's very strong engagement with the world. CETA was a fine force, which was great. But when the Depression, when these very complex issues began to set in, CETA began to withdraw. They became more and more obsessed with, accountability to their taxpayers, and it became much more inefficient. And this book was an attempt to raise those issues, would attempt to address so many of the things which, in the years that were to come, were to make the development enterprise really complicated and just eventually almost impossible. And so it was, in a way, it was a harbinger of things that came. But it was a good book, and it took a lot of my effort to try to put this book together so that we would have a really good understanding of what now were the problems in development. And it was great. It was great. But that was really quite a few years ago. I guess, yeah. Is this a good place to stop? Well, I think what we'll do is I'd like to introduce what I think I have learned, and in the next session, I'd like to now just say that what I'd like to talk about is I think that gives me an opportunity to say a few words about what are the key issues in development for me, and and how my anthropological background has been helpful in identifying them. It won't be so full of stories. It'll have more a set of ideas maybe in them, but they have been. These are ideas I think that have really guided my thinking in advising, in the work that I've done advising the World Bank and governments and the European Union in particular, and United Nations, in trying to do something about the larger problems in the world.